Right this instant, Trump is calling for Carney to step down. The reply from Canada has rendered Washington stunned. At 9:23 a.m. today, Eastern Time, during a private session at the White House, an event took place that has no precedent in the 78 years of post-war diplomacy between transatlantic allies. Donald Trump, during a telephone conversation that went on for precisely 14 minutes and 31 seconds, based on accounts from 3 insiders informed about the exchange, explicitly required that Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney leave his position. Not implied, not alluded to, but outright required. And the developments in Ottawa afterward marked the most significant episode in U.S.-Canada ties since the War of 1812. I want you to grasp the seriousness of what I'm going to share, because the occurrences over the subsequent 6 hours aren't merely a matter of international relations. This is an examination of whether allied democracies can preserve their independence when the globe's strongest country concludes that overseas votes, administrations, and officials fall under American disapproval. If you're concerned about the fate of the global system in the coming 72 hours, you should join this channel immediately and activate alerts, since the situations developing right now will decide if U.S. influence continues to function inside any familiar limits, or if we've stepped into a period where the U.S. leader thinks he can appoint and dismiss the heads of independent countries. This is what we've learned. 3 separate informants, 2 from the National Security Council team and 1 from a top assistant to the Secretary of State, have verified for us the precise order of happenings that played out this morning. The discussion was started by Trump at 9:07 a.m. from the Oval Office. It wasn't planned. It wasn't listed on any formal agenda. Based on the official summary sent to my contact fewer than 4 hours back, Trump began the talk by declaring that Prime Minister Carney's financial strategies, particularly his unwillingness to reduce Canadian interest rates in sync with expected Federal Reserve actions, constituted a direct risk to U.S. financial safety. The exchange, as per all 3 informants, grew intense in the initial 3 minutes. Trump informed Carney, and I'm citing straight from the records made by an employee who was in the situation room overseeing the discussion, that unless Carney stepped aside within 48 hours and permitted a more agreeable administration to assume control in Ottawa, the United States would apply what Trump termed, and this is an exact citation, financial steps that would force Canada to reconsider its whole connection with the United States. Now, allow me to demonstrate precisely what occurred afterward and why each international relations specialist I've consulted in the past 6 hours is employing terms like unparalleled, disastrous, and governmental emergency. Based on flight monitoring information, which is openly accessible via sites such as Flight Radar 24, a Canadian official plane left from Ottawa MacDonald Cartier International Airport at 11:42 a.m. Eastern Time, precisely 2 hours and 35 minutes following the end of Trump's call. That plane touched down at Joint Base Andrews near Washington at 12:58 p.m. Aboard that plane was Canada's foreign minister, who went straight to the State Department for what informants portray as the most strained international discussion between U.S. and Canadian authorities in contemporary times. What I'm preparing to reveal isn't guesswork. This is a recreation drawn from firsthand insights from individuals updated right after that discussion concluded. Let me guide you through exactly how this unfolded, because the schedule is tremendously important. This didn't emerge suddenly. This was a series of choices, errors in judgment, and deliberate challenges, and each phase was recorded. On Tuesday, February 18th, Mark Carney, who took over as Canada's Prime Minister only 47 days earlier after securing a convincing win in the polls, revealed a thorough financial strategy plan in a broadcast speech to the Canadian Parliament. The core of that plan was a pledge to keep interest rates elevated compared to the United States Federal Reserve to fight what Carney labeled as inflationary forces specific to the Canadian market, especially skyrocketing home prices in Toronto and Vancouver that have hit emergency stages. Carney, a previous head of the Bank of England and among the most admired central bankers globally, declared clearly that Canada's financial approach would be determined autonomously according to Canadian market situations, not aligned with U.S. Federal Reserve choices. On Thursday, February 20th, 2 days following Carney's reveal, Trump conducted a cabinet gathering in the Roosevelt Room, where, as per two informants aware of the talk, he labeled Carney's approach as a betrayal of the unified North American market. Trump instructed his financial consultants to develop what he referred to as pressure tactics for aligning Canada with U.S. financial strategy desires. One informant characterized Trump's words as astonishingly direct, noting that the leader remarked, and I cite, "We control their market, and they must recall that." On Saturday, February 22nd, Trump shared on Truth Social at 6:47 a.m. a note that numerous analysts brushed off as standard early complaints, but which, looking back, was the initial strike in what evolved into a complete international offensive. The share stated, "Mark Carney is ruining the Canadian market with extreme high interest rates that are harming diligent Canadians. Numerous individuals are stating he ought to step down and allow somebody who grasps economics to assume control. The United States will not remain idle while our primary trading associate engages in market self-destruction." The share got 847,000 approvals in 6 hours and was circulated by several right-wing media personalities who started portraying Carney as opposed to America. On Monday, February 24th, the affront echoed worldwide. At a White House gathering honoring U.S. production, Trump, delivering without scripted comments, gazed straight into the lens and remarked, "Mark Carney, if you're viewing, you're dismissed. Except you can't dismiss him since he serves Canada. But if I could dismiss him, I would. He's a catastrophe. Awful for Canada. Awful for the United States. Awful for North America. The Canadian citizens merit superior." The remark was aired live on all key news outlets. Within 2 hours, the Canadian Embassy in Washington released a concise note advising the White House that Canada is an autonomous country and that its Prime Minister is selected by Canadian electors, not designated by outside authorities. That occurred 4 days prior. Now, this is where it turns risky. As per various informants, and I'm referring to folks with connections to both U.S. international staff and Canadian administration officials, Trump viewed Canada's reply not as a defense of democratic autonomy, but as resistance needing intensification. From Monday night to Wednesday morning, Trump conducted at least 3 distinct talks with his commerce consultant regarding possible duty actions aimed at Canadian shipments. One informant depicted these exchanges as Trump inquiring repeatedly, what damages them the greatest and how quickly can we execute it, which leads us to this morning at 9:07 when Trump grabbed the telephone and resolved that proposing Carney's departure was inadequate. He required it. Now, permit me to explain who Mark Carney truly is, because this isn't some arbitrary public figure seeking publicity. This is possibly the most qualified economist to lead a government in any G7 nation over the past 30 years. Carney was head of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013, steering Canada through the worldwide financial meltdown, with strategies that led to Canada being the sole G7 country to retain its AA credit status during the entire meltdown. He subsequently was head of the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020, where he handled Brexit market instability and received broad acclaim from both Conservative and Labour Party figures for his impartiality and skill. Carney possesses qualifications from Harvard and Oxford and has authored widely on monetary steadiness and central finance. When he joined Canadian politics and secured the Liberal Party direction in December, it was seen worldwide as Canada obtaining one of the planet's leading financial intellects to maneuver a progressively intricate international market. This isn't an individual who reacts positively to being instructed by an overseas head to depart. And this isn't a nation with any past custom of permitting Washington to command its internal political direction. Canada has been a self-governing country since 1867. It has battled beside the United States in each significant clash since World War I. It is America's biggest commerce associate with $718 billion in mutual exchange yearly. And now, for the initial occasion in the chronicle of that bond, an American leader has straightforwardly required that Canada's elected head withdraw. If you're discovering this useful, press that approval icon immediately, because this narrative is on the verge of becoming much more intricate, and you'll desire to stay for the entirety. Each approval informs the system. This narrative is important and assists in distributing this material to additional folks who ought to learn the facts about what's occurring to the global system currently. This is what transpired at 1:47 p.m. Eastern Time within the State Department. Canada's foreign minister, joined by the Canadian representative to the United States, positioned opposite the Secretary of State in a session that endured 1 hour and 23 minutes. As per somebody who was informed on the session within 2 hours of its finish, the Canadian foreign minister started by asserting that Canada absolutely dismisses any proposal that its prime minister should depart due to the requirements of an external administration. The foreign minister then conveyed what informants describe as the sharpest international communication Canada has ever dispatched to the United States during tranquility. The communication, as per my informant, included 3 components. First, Canada views Trump's requirement for Carney's departure as an unmatched infringement of Canadian independence and a meddling in Canada's democratic mechanisms. Second, Canada will not modify its financial strategies based on intimidations or final warnings from any external authority, including the United States. Third, if the United States advances with any financial reprisal directed at Canada because of its refusal to adhere to this requirement, Canada will counter with prompt opposing actions and will bring up the issue at the United Nations, the G7, NATO, and each worldwide platform where inquiries about American regard for partner independence can be debated openly. The Secretary of State, as per my informant, seemed obviously uneasy during the session, remarking at one moment that the leaders' declarations do not automatically mirror official U.S. strategy and that international pathways stay available for settling any financial disputes. But this is what worries me the greatest. The Canadian foreign minister apparently replied by stating that Trump's telephone discussion this morning was not an international dispute. It was a call for government alteration in a G7 democracy, and Canada's reply is that the United States does not select Canada's administration. Join now if you wish to track where this emergency heads, because the consequences are enormous, and traditional media will lag 3 hours behind all I'm presenting. But hold on, there's an even graver aspect I haven't disclosed yet. At 3:34 p.m., under 2 hours after the State Department session finished, Prime Minister Carney conducted an urgent media briefing in Ottawa that was transmitted live throughout Canada and broadcast globally. Positioned at a lectern in the House of Commons, Carney presented a 7-minute declaration that Canadian political analysts are already labeling the strongest claim of Canadian separation from U.S. sway in contemporary chronicle. Carney commenced by verifying that he had gotten a telephone discussion from President Trump this morning in which the leader proposed that Carney should think about leaving. Carney then declared, and I want you to listen to his precise terms because they signify a pivotal instant. Canada is an independent country. Our administration is selected by Canadian electors in open and equitable votes. No overseas head, irrespective of the influence they possess, has the right to require the departure of Canada's Prime Minister. I was chosen by the Canadian populace 47 days prior with a distinct directive to follow financial strategies that benefit Canadian concerns. I plan to accomplish that directive. Canada's financial strategy will persist to be established autonomously according to Canadian market situations. We will not yield our financial independence to intimidations or final warnings from any source. The chamber burst into cheers from Canadian lawmakers from various groups. Conservative Party directors, who typically resist Carney's Liberal administration on almost all strategy matters, released declarations within the hour, conveying complete backing for Carney's protection of Canadian independence. The director of the Conservative Resistance declared, "We differ with Prime Minister Carney on numerous topics, but on this matter, there is no difference among Canadians. Our Prime Minister is picked by us, not by Washington, and it worsens." At 4:52 p.m., the European Union released a declaration via its High Delegate for International Matters, voicing worry about accounts of U.S. meddling in the democratic mechanisms of partner countries, and restating the EU's dedication to the idea that democratic administrations are responsible to their own people, not to external authorities. At 5:18 p.m., the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary released a meticulously phrased declaration stressing the significance of honoring the independence and democratic mechanisms of all countries inside the rules-based global system. What you are observing is America's nearest partners in actual time openly dismissing the idea that the United States possesses the right to call for direction shifts in democratic nations. This is not a small international squabble. This is the foundation of the post-war partnership arrangement, starting to crack over a basic inquiry. Does U.S. influence work within any restrictions, or has it grown disconnected from the standards, organizations, and shared regard that have directed the democratic globe for 78 years? Ensure you're joined with alerts activated, because this narrative is distant from complete. When Canada discloses its opposing actions, when the G7 convenes its urgent meeting, when NATO partners start doubting U.S. direction, you will view in-depth examination here right away. Previous U.S. Ambassador to Canada, David Cohen, who worked under 3 distinct governments, informed CNN this afternoon something that ought to prompt everyone to notice. He remarked, and I cite, "In 40 years of examining U.S.-Canada ties, I have never witnessed anything even close to an American leader requiring that Canada's Prime Minister depart. This violates every boundary of international behavior and partner regard. If this turns standard, if U.S. leaders think they can merely require that partner heads withdraw, the whole structure of democratic collaboration falls apart." Constitutional law instructor Rebecca Winters from Yale Law School, who focuses on global ties and democratic standards, declared in a discussion this evening that Trump's requirement signifies what she termed democratic expansionism, the conviction that U.S. choices supersede the voting selections of other democracies. She stressed that if the United States moves forward with financial punishment against Canada for declining to follow this requirement, it would mark the initial occasion in contemporary chronicle that America has penalized a partner for upholding democratic independence. This is what I'm monitoring for in the next 48 hours that will explode this narrative completely. First, whether Trump acts on his warning of financial actions against Canada. Various informants suggest that commerce consultants are drafting an executive directive applying duties on Canadian steel, aluminum, and wood, possibly impacting $87 billion in yearly exchange. If Trump authorizes that directive, Canada has already drafted a reprisal set aimed at U.S. farming shipments from politically vital regions, including Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Second, whether other G7 heads release open declarations either endorsing Canada's stance or staying quiet. Quietness from usual partners would indicate that democratic countries are reluctant to challenge U.S. excess, even when it straightforwardly endangers their own independence. Third, whether this emergency impacts the forthcoming NATO gathering planned for next month. Canada is an original participant in NATO and a vital associate in North American protection. If this intensifies, Canadian officials might utilize the NATO gathering to pose wider inquiries about whether a coalition directed by a country that calls for government shift in partner democracies can sustain reliability. The next 72 hours will settle whether this turns into a brief emergency that gets reversed through international pathways, or whether it signifies a lasting rupture in how the United States interacts with democratic partners. Allow me to tie this up because we are short on time and the timer is advancing quicker than most folks comprehend. What occurred today is not a standalone occurrence. It is the reasonable progression of a method to U.S. influence that admits no limitations, honors no principles, and recognizes no difference between opponents and partners. When the leader of the United States thinks he can contact an overseas head and require their departure, and when that overseas head declines and the leader warns financial penalty, you are seeing the breakdown of the arrangement that has averted major authority clashes for almost 8 decades. Allow me to outline the 3 possibilities that are now available. Scenario 1, Trump retreats. Probability quintet in this outcome faced with unified opposition from Canada, quiet pressure from European allies, and warnings from his own State Department that this emergency endangers basic partnership frameworks. Trump releases some dignity-preserving declaration asserting he was misread or that he was just providing amicable guidance. Carney stays in position, upholds its financial strategy, autonomy, and the emergency fades. But even in this optimal possibility, the harm is accomplished. accomplished. Every Democratic partner now understands that the American leader thinks he has the right to require their departure, and that awareness eternally changes the mindset of the partnership. Scenario 2, financial conflict. Probability 45%. Trump advances with duties aimed at Canadian shipments. Canada counters instantly with its drafted opposing action set. Exchange between the two nations, which sustains millions of employment on both borders, shrinks dramatically. U.S. producers who rely on Canadian supplies encounter delivery network interruptions. Canadian buyers encounter elevated costs on U.S. products. The market suffering is spread across both nations, but the political suffering is focused on Trump, who now possesses a commerce battle with America's nearest partner and biggest exchange associate. Republican lawmakers from boundary regions start getting contacts from commerce directors demanding the emergency be settled. This possibility probably concludes with reluctant reduction after both parties cause market harm, but with U.S.-Canada ties basically tainted for years. Scenario 3, partnership split. Probability 40%. This is the result that should truly alarm anyone who grasps how the post-war arrangement operates. Canada does not retreat. Trump does not retreat. Financial actions are applied. Canada brings up the topic at the United Nations, referencing Article 2 of the UN Charter on Sovereign Equality of Nations. European partners, already irritated with U.S. unreliability, start openly inquiring whether partnerships with the United States offer protection or instability. The G7 meeting gets overtaken by this emergency. Instead of tackling China, Russia, or worldwide market alignment, NATO participants start questioning whether an entity directed by a country that intimidates partners over market strategy disagreements can reliably protect group safety. The split is not theatrical or instant, but gradual and irreversible. U.S. direction of the democratic globe diminishes, not through armed loss, but through ethical disqualification. But this is why this is relevant past this single instance. The risks extend much further than whether Mark Carney continues as Canada's Prime Minister or whether duties are applied on Canadian wood. This concerns whether democratic countries stay independent, or whether U.S. influence has grown so detached that the leader of the United States thinks overseas votes, administrations, and heads exist at his discretion. If Trump can require that Canada's Prime Minister depart and warn market ruin if Canada declines, what stops him from issuing comparable requirements to Mexico, to European partners, to any democracy whose strategies he disapproves? And if those requirements turn standard, if the model becomes set that U.S. leaders can just contact partner heads and command them to withdraw, then democracy itself turns secondary to U.S. supreme choice. So what can you really accomplish regarding this? Because I recognize many of you are viewing this sensing helpless. First, reach out to your lawmakers and delegates, particularly if you reside in a boundary region or a region with substantial exchange bonds with Canada. Inform them that intimidating partners over democratic independence is intolerable, and that Congress possesses the governmental right to limit executive excess in international strategy. Second, distribute this footage. Most Americans lack awareness this emergency is developing because traditional media lags 3 hours, and when they do report it, they handle it as a standard Trump dispute rather than a basic risk to partner democracy. Third, observe how other democratic heads reply. If European partners remain quiet, if they favor their own bonds with Washington over protecting the idea that democracies pick their own heads, that reveals everything you require to understand about the destiny of the democratic partnership. Join this channel immediately, because in the next 72 hours, all could alter, and I will be the initial to deliver you the analysis before the propaganda device has an opportunity to conceal the facts. What occurs next will settle whether the global system endures this leadership or whether we are observing its actual time breakdown. The next 7